The land remembers what you forget, she warned, and the cowboy knelt in the ashes. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and gold, and the wind whispered across the dry plains like it carried secrets from long ago. A lone cowboy rode slowly along a dusty trail, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of earth with every step. His hat shaded his eyes, but the deep lines on his face showed years of life under the sun. Years filled with hard work, rough nights, and decisions he wasn't proud of. The cowboy's name was Jeb, though few around the frontier knew him well. He liked it that way. Solitude suited him. The land was a companion that didn't ask questions, and the quiet didn't remind him of the past. As he rode, Jeb noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trail. She was an older woman, but not so old that she looked frail. Her hair, streaked with gray, was tied loosely, and her eyes had a sharpness that seemed to see everything at once. She wore simple clothes, faded from sun and washing, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived all her life on the land. Something about her made the cowboy pause. There was a calm in her presence, but also a weight, like she carried the memories of the land itself. Jeb slowed his horse as he approached, raising a hand in greeting. "Evening," he said, his voice rough from days of talking mostly to himself or the wind. "Evening, stranger," the woman replied, her voice steady and soft, but with an edge that made Jeb sit up straighter. "You're far from town. The trail's empty, but it carries stories if you know how to listen." Jeb gave a short nod. He had heard such warnings before, but something in her tone made him uneasy. "I know my way," he said simply. He didn't need anyone telling him what he already knew. The frontier didn't forgive mistakes, and he had learned to trust only himself. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and she took a step closer. "You might know the trail," she said, "but the land remembers more than we do. It remembers what people forget, and sometimes it doesn't forgive." Jeb frowned, gripping the reins tighter. Her words were strange, almost like a riddle. He had heard old-timers talk about the land-holding memory, about the plains carrying echoes of past deeds, but he had never thought much of it. Stories like that were for children, or for people who had too much time to sit and worry about ghosts. Yet there was something in her voice that made his heart skip. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something deeper, a warning that brushed against the edge of his mind. "You speak like the land has eyes," he said cautiously. "I've been riding these plains for years. I've seen plenty, and the land don't care about me or my past." The woman smiled faintly, but it was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that carries memory and sadness at the same time. "The land may not care today," she said, "but it remembers. Fires, betrayals, promises broken. It keeps them. You can ride fast and far, cowboy, but the land waits, and one day it asks you to pay attention." Jeb looked away, scanning the horizon. The wind bent the tall grasses in waves, and the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. He shifted in the saddle, uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. Something about this woman, about her words, made him feel like he was standing on the edge of something he didn't fully understand, a story he had begun, but refused to finish. "Listen," the woman continued, stepping closer, her voice lowering, almost a whisper now. "You think you can forget the past, leave it behind, but the land doesn't forget. Every tree, every stone, every gust of wind, it remembers. And when you forget, it reminds you, sometimes gently, sometimes with fire." Jeb's hand brushed against the handle of his rifle, though he didn't raise it. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what she might be talking about. Memories he had buried deep stirred, small flashes at first, a house burned in the distance, laughter cut short the look in someone's eyes when trust was broken. He shook his head, trying to push it away. Those things were gone, or so he had told himself for years. "Cowboy," the woman said again, softer this time. "I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to warn you. You can keep riding, keep pretending the past doesn't exist. But one day, you'll come to the ashes, and you'll remember everything you tried to forget." Jeb swallowed, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. He had faced storms, bandits, and nights so cold he thought he would freeze to death. Yet this feeling in his chest, was different. It was a cold, heavy weight, like the land itself had reached out and touched him. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Why come find me?" The woman's eyes softened, though the warning in them did not fade. "Because the land knows you," she said simply. "It knows what you've tried to hide, what you've left behind. It's waiting for you to remember, cowboy. And the longer you ignore it, the harder it will be when it calls." For a moment, Jeb wanted to turn his horse and ride as fast as he could, to leave the woman and her strange warnings behind. He wanted to tell himself it was just an old story, a superstition, nothing more. But the weight in his chest held him, and he felt the wind shift, carrying a faint scent of smoke, dry earth, and something older, something he couldn't name. "Maybe I'm not ready," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You may never feel ready," the woman replied. "The land doesn't wait for readiness. It just waits. And one day, you'll kneel in the ashes and finally remember. I hope it's sooner rather than later." Jeb's horse shifted under him nervously, sensing the tension he hadn't noticed before. He finally looked at the woman fully, taking in her lined face, her steady eyes, and the way she seemed to belong to the land itself, as if she were part of it, carved from its soil and shaped by its storms. There was truth in her warning, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Without another word, the woman turned and began walking away from the trail, her figure slowly blending with the tall grasses and the setting sun. Jeb stayed in the saddle, watching her, feeling the weight of her words settle deep into his bones. He wanted to call out, to ask more, but his voice caught in his throat. Somehow, he knew that this encounter was only the beginning, that the plains he had ridden for years were about to become something more than open trails and empty horizons. The cowboy stayed there until the last light of the sun disappeared, the sky turning dark blue and purple, with stars beginning to pierce the twilight. He could still feel her eyes on him. Or maybe it was the land itself. Either way, he knew one thing. He could not ride forever from what he had forgotten, and though he tried to ignore the truth, a small, uneasy thought whispered through his mind. Maybe the land had already begun keeping track of his deeds, waiting for the day he could no longer pretend. When Jeb finally nudged his horse forward, the night air was cool against his face, and the trail ahead seemed longer than ever before. He rode in silence, listening to the wind through the grass and the quiet of the plains, knowing that something had shifted. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "The land remembers what you forget." He didn't understand it fully yet, but he felt it deep in his chest, a weight that would not be lifted by distance or time. And for the first time in years, the cowboy rode with a question in his heart, not about survival, not about the miles ahead, but about the past he had buried, the choices he had made and the land that had waited patiently, silently, to remind him. The next morning, the cowboy woke before the sun, the memory of the woman's warning still pressing against his mind. The trail ahead stretched into a quiet valley, dust rising from the ground as his horse pawed impatiently at the dry soil. Jeb had traveled these plains many times before, but today felt different. The wind seemed sharper, carrying whispers that he could not quite understand. The land was alive with memory, he realized, and it was calling him back to things he had tried to leave behind. He had heard the stories of abandoned homesteads, of houses burned in the night and families gone without explanation. People in the town spoke of them in low tones, as if naming them too loudly might awaken old ghosts. Jeb had never paid much attention. He thought such tales belonged to those who were afraid of the dark or of the endless sky. But now, with the woman's warning echoing in his mind, he couldn't help but feel that these stories were connected to him somehow. Something deep in his memory stirred, like a spark buried under layers of dust and time. The trail led him along a narrow creek, where water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and moss, mingling with the faint scent of smoke that lingered from last night's thoughts. Jeb rode slowly, scanning the horizon for signs of life, of something familiar, but all he saw were the skeletal remains of trees, twisted and scorched as if the land itself had been through a fire not long ago. Each time he saw a blackened branch or a charred log, a small piece of memory flickered in his mind. A sound, a word, a feeling. But before he could hold it, it vanished like smoke. He remembered the woman's words, "The land remembers what you forget." At first he had dismissed it as superstition, but now, riding through the quiet reminders of what had been lost, he began to understand. The land did remember. Every scar in the soil, every mark left by fire or storm, carried a story. And he had been part of some of those stories, though he could not yet recall the details. As the sun climbed higher, Jeb came upon the remains of an old barn. Its walls had collapsed, leaving charred beams pointing toward the sky. The smell of burned wood filled the air, sharp and bitter. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the ashes. Kneeling, he ran his hands over the blackened timber, feeling the heat still trapped inside from fires long extinguished. Something about this place felt familiar, like a puzzle he had left incomplete years ago. He explored cautiously, stepping over fallen boards and through the shadows of what once had been. His mind swirled with fragments of memories, laughter that ended too soon, voices shouting in panic, the sudden crackle of flames, but they were only fragments, and he could not piece them together. The land seemed to hum beneath him, silent but insistent, as if it knew he was searching for answers. Hours passed, and the sky turned a pale blue. Jeb finally mounted his horse and continued along the trail, following the creek into a narrow canyon. The walls of stone rose high, casting long shadows that stretched across the path. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying voices that were not there, echoes of lives long gone. He slowed, uneasy, but unable to stop. Something deeper than curiosity drove him forward, a need to confront what he had buried in his past. As he rode, he came across a small grove of trees, the trunks blackened from fire but still standing, defiant against the elements. In the center of the grove, he saw a patch of earth that looked different, disturbed, as if someone had tried to plant life there long ago but failed. He dismounted again, kneeling to touch the soil. The texture was rough, scarred, but under it, life was struggling to grow. A few green shoots pushed through the ashes, fragile but determined. For a moment, Jeb thought about how similar it was to himself. He had been riding through life thinking he could leave the past behind, but like the land, he had scars that refused to heal until he faced them. The thought made his chest tighten. He realized that he had been running, not from people, not from danger, but from the memory of a night he had buried deep in his mind, a night that shaped everything that came after. The wind shifted suddenly, stronger now, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He looked up and saw the woman from yesterday standing on a ridge above him, watching silently. She did not call out, did not gesture. She simply observed, her presence a reminder that he was being guided, warned, and tested, all at once. He raised a hand briefly, but she only nodded and disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. The day wore on, and Jeb found himself riding toward the remains of a small town. Buildings leaned precariously, their roofs caved in, windows broken, doors missing. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional caw of a crow. The air smelled of dry dust, old smoke, and something else he could not name, the scent of memory itself. He dismounted and walked slowly, examining the remnants of homes and shops, each carrying traces of lives interrupted. In one of the homes he found a burned journal, its pages blackened but still legible. He picked it up carefully, turning the pages with reverence. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, filled with worry and hope, and each entry spoke of ordinary lives disrupted by fire, by betrayal, by choices that could not be undone. As he read, Jeb felt a strange connection, as if the land itself had led him here to witness these stories. Some entries spoke of people he vaguely remembered, faces he had seen long ago, lives that intersected with his own without him realizing it. By the time the sun began to set, Jeb knew he could not leave. He had followed the trail of memory this far, and the land demanded he go further. The shadows lengthened, the wind grew colder, and he felt the weight of years pressing down on him. He camped near the edge of town, building a small fire to keep the chill away, and sat in silence, thinking about the woman's warning and the fragments of memory that kept surfacing. Night fell and the stars appeared, bright and clear in the open sky. The cowboy could hear the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small animals in the brush, and the whisper of the wind through the broken buildings. He thought about the past, about the choices he had made, and about the fire that had taken so much from him and others, and for the first time he admitted to himself that running had not helped. The past was not behind him. It was here, waiting, in the ashes, in the soil, in the memory of the land itself. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of fire, smoke, and shadowed faces. He woke before dawn, feeling the pull of the trail again. There was more to see, more to remember, and he knew he could not stop until he understood it all. The land had begun to speak to him piece by piece, and he could not turn away. As the first light of morning spread across the plains, Jeb mounted his horse and rode toward the distant hills, the trail winding through valleys, groves, and burned remnants of life. Each step brought him closer to the memories he had buried, each mile a reminder that the land did indeed remember what he had forgotten. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, he sensed the place where the truth awaited, a place of ashes, of reckoning, and perhaps of redemption. The cowboy rode on, his heart heavy but determined, feeling the weight of both the past and the land itself. He did not know what he would find or what he would have to face when he did, but he knew one thing: the land never forgets, and neither could he. The morning light was pale and cold as Jeb rode into the canyon, the wind whispering through the jagged rocks like voices from long ago. Each step of his horse brought him closer to the place he had avoided for so many years, a place he had told himself was gone forever. But now the traces of the past were everywhere, in the scorched trees, in the twisted metal of old fences, and in the ashes that seemed to cling stubbornly to the earth. The land was patient, persistent, and it was demanding his attention. Jeb's mind wandered as he rode, remembering flashes he had long tried to forget. There had been a fire, yes, but also the faces of people he had cared about, people whose trust he had betrayed or ignored. He tried to push the thoughts away, telling himself that he was riding only to survive, only to see what remained of the old homesteads. Yet every turn in the trail, every rustle of dry leaves, felt like a question he could not ignore. "Do you remember now, cowboy?" The canyon opened into a small valley, and there it was. The remains of a homestead he knew immediately, though he could not yet recall the details. The land around it was blackened, the earth scorched and uneven, a faint smoke still rising from the ashes as if the fire had only just passed. The house itself was gone, nothing but a few crumbling walls and charred beams pointing toward the sky. A fallen fence marked the boundary of the property, its wood splintered and blackened. Jeb's horse slowed instinctively, sensing the heaviness of the place. Jeb dismounted and stepped onto the ground, feeling the heat of the ashes beneath his boots. The smell of burnt wood and dry earth filled the air, a smell he recognized from memories he had buried too deep to name. He crouched to touch the soil, feeling its rough texture and the faint warmth that lingered even after so many years. His mind was a whirlwind of fragments, laughter, shouting, the crackle of fire, and a voice calling his name. Each memory flickered like a candle in the wind, almost too bright and too painful to hold. He walked slowly through what remained of the homestead, running his hands over the blackened timbers and broken stones. He stopped at the edge of the fireplace, where he remembered the warmth of family dinners long ago. And then the chaos of fire and smoke. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to feel grief. He had thought that time could erase everything, that distance could bury the past, but now he realized that memory lived in the land itself, waiting to be confronted. Jeb found a small, charred box, half buried in the ashes. He knelt and carefully lifted it, brushing away dirt and soot. Inside were letters, singed at the edges but still legible. He unfolded one and began to read, the handwriting shaky but familiar. The words spoke of hope, fear, and betrayal, of decisions made in desperation and promises broken too soon. As he read, memories began to return, clearer now, forming a story he had long avoided. He remembered the fire, the panic, the faces of people he had failed to protect. He remembered trying to outrun the flames, trying to save what he could, and then running from the guilt that weighed him down. The woman's words returned to him. "The land remembers what you forget." Now he understood. The land had never let him forget. It had been waiting patiently for him to confront what he had hidden in the corners of his mind. The wind shifted, stronger now, carrying a faint smell of smoke and ash. Jeb looked up and saw the woman from the trail standing at a distance, her figure calm and watchful. She did not call out, did not gesture, but her presence was a silent reminder that he was not alone in this reckoning. The land and its keeper, he thought, watching her disappear slowly behind a ridge. He realized that he had been guided here not by chance, but by something deeper, something that had always been a part of him, even when he refused to remember. He continued exploring the homestead, moving through the remains of the barn and the old corral. The ground was littered with burned tools, half-melted tin cans, and broken horseshoes. Each item told a story, a fragment of life that had been interrupted by fire, neglect, or a single careless choice. Jeb felt a pang of guilt as he picked up a small toy, blackened but intact, and held it in his hands. He remembered a child, someone he had once known, whose laughter had filled this very valley. The memory brought tears to his eyes, tears he had long believed were unnecessary or weak. Hours passed, and the sun moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows over the valley. Jeb sat on a fallen log, trying to piece together the story from the fragments before him. He realized that he had been running from more than guilt. He had been running from the truth, from the consequences of his actions, from the fact that the land remembered everything he had tried to erase. And now he understood he could not escape. The land demanded recognition, acknowledgement, and maybe, eventually, redemption. He began to gather the burned remains of letters, photographs, and small personal items, placing them carefully in a bundle. Each piece carried a memory, a story that deserved to be remembered, even if it was painful. As he worked, he noticed that the valley seemed to respond to him. A gentle breeze stirred the ashes, a bird called from a distant tree, and the ground beneath his feet seemed less harsh, almost alive. The land was not just a witness, it was a partner in memory, a keeper of truths that humans often tried to forget. Night approached and the shadows deepened across the valley. Jeb built a small fire, careful not to ignite the dry brush around him, and sat watching the flames. The crackling wood mirrored the fire that had taken so much from this place, and yet the fire in his heart was different now. It was not just guilt or fear, it was a determination to face the past, to remember, and perhaps, one day, to make amends. As darkness fell, the stars appeared in the clear sky above. The silence of the valley was broken only by the occasional rustle of animals and the whisper of wind through the scorched trees. Jeb felt a strange peace, though it was tempered by the weight of memory. He realized that the land had been waiting for him, guiding him back to this place, not to punish him, but to help him remember. And with memory came understanding, and with understanding came a chance to heal. Before sleep claimed him, Jeb looked once more at the remains of the homestead, at the blackened walls and the scattered ashes. He understood, finally, that he could not undo the past, but he could honor it. He could acknowledge the lives affected, the choices made, and the consequences that followed. And in that acknowledgement, perhaps he could find a way to rebuild, not just the land, but himself. As he lay down near the fire, the wind whispered once more through the valley, and Jeb closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the land and the past settle around him. He knew that the journey was far from over. The ashes held more than remnants of buildings. They held stories, truths, and memories that demanded attention. And he would face them all, one by one, guided by the land that remembered what he had long tried to forget. The next morning, Jeb woke with a heaviness he could not shake. The valley was quiet, almost unbearably so, and yet it seemed to hum with memory. The ashes beneath his boots felt heavier now, as if the land itself was asking him to kneel, to pay attention, to face what he had avoided for so long. He knew that he could not ride away, could not turn his back on what the land demanded. The past was here, waiting, and he had no choice but to confront it. He rose from his makeshift camp and mounted his horse, moving slowly through the blackened remnants of the homestead. Each step was a journey into memory. The charred walls and twisted metal fences were no longer just debris. They were witnesses, markers of choices made and promises broken. Jeb felt a knot in his chest, tightening with each memory that surfaced. He remembered a fire, yes, but also the faces of people who had trusted him, people whose lives had been changed forever by his decisions. The wind shifted suddenly, and with it came a faint whisper, almost like a voice carried from the past. Jeb stopped, listening. It was the voice of the woman from the trail, though she was nowhere in sight. The land remembers what you forget, it seemed to say, carried on the wind and through the rustling of the scorched trees. He closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him. He could see the flames, hear the panic, feel the heat and the smoke that had once consumed so much of this place. Kneeling in the ashes, Jeb finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He touched the scorched ground, running his hands through blackened soil and broken stones. Each item he picked up, a charred piece of furniture, a burned tool, a melted tin can, was a piece of memory, a fragment of life interrupted by fire and misfortune. He could no longer pretend that it did not matter. The land remembered, and now he remembered too. Tears came unbidden. He remembered faces, a young girl with wide, trusting eyes, a father who had once laughed easily, a mother who had worked tirelessly to keep the homestead together. And he remembered his own choices, decisions made in fear or anger, moments when he had turned away instead of standing firm. The memories were sharp, painful, and unavoidable. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth to himself. He had failed. He had failed the people he cared about, and failed to honor the land that had given him life and shelter. The sky above darkened as clouds gathered, and the wind rose, carrying the faint scent of smoke and the tang of rain. Jeb stayed kneeling, letting the elements wash over him, feeling the connection between the land and his own soul. He realized that the land did not punish. It simply remembered. It held a record of what had been done and what had been left undone, and it demanded acknowledgement. And now, after all these years, he was ready to give it. Slowly, he began to gather the remnants of the homestead. He picked up letters, photographs, and small personal items, placing them carefully in a bundle. Each piece carried a story, and he treated them with reverence. As he worked, he spoke quietly, almost as if confessing to the land itself. "I see now," he said, his voice breaking. "I see everything I tried to forget. I understand, and I am sorry." The words felt heavy but necessary, and with each one, a small part of the burden lifted from his shoulders. Hours passed, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the valley. The land seemed to respond, the shadows retreating, the wind softening, the scent of dry earth and new growth mingling with the faint smell of smoke. Jeb felt a sense of clarity he had not known in years. The past was not gone, and the land would never forget, but acknowledgement had power. Recognition, he realized, could heal some of the wounds, if not all. He wandered through the valley, placing the collected items in a small, protected corner, creating a kind of memorial. It was not grand, nor was it perfect, but it was a start, a sign that he remembered, that he cared, that he was willing to face the truth rather than run from it. The wind whispered through the scorched trees as if approving, carrying his words away and embedding them into the memory of the land itself. Jeb sat on a fallen log and looked out across the valley. He could see the outlines of the burned homestead, the blackened trees, and the scorched earth stretching into the distance. And yet, in that destruction, there was life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the ashes, stubborn and bright against the black soil. The land itself was showing him a lesson he had not understood before. Even after devastation, growth was possible. Healing was possible, if only one had the courage to begin. The wind shifted again, and he thought he saw a figure moving in the distance. It was the woman from the trail. She watched silently from the ridge, her presence calm but commanding. Jeb did not call to her. He did not need to. Her purpose had always been to guide him, to warn him, to remind him that the land kept memory even when people tried to forget. Now, he understood. The woman had been the voice of that memory, a reminder that acknowledgement and humility were not weaknesses but necessary acts of courage. Night fell slowly and the stars appeared in the clear sky above the valley. Jeb built a small fire, letting its warmth and light reach the corners of the place that had once been consumed by darkness. He sat quietly, thinking about the lessons he had learned. The past could not be changed. Fire had burned the homestead, mistakes had been made, and lives had been lost. But memory, acknowledgement, and care could transform the present. The ashes he knelt in were not just reminders of destruction, they were symbols of renewal. As he gazed into the flames, Jeb realized that the land had given him a choice. He could either continue to hide from the past, living with guilt and fear, or he could face it, accept it, and begin to make amends in whatever small ways he could. The decision was his, but the land had already made its position clear. It remembered everything, and it required honesty. He stayed awake most of the night, listening to the wind, the distant calls of animals, and the faint rustle of leaves. Sleep came fitfully, but when it did, it brought dreams that were no longer filled with smoke and fire. Instead, he saw the faces of people he had loved, memories of moments when life had been simple and full, and images of the valley recovering, green shoots growing through the ashes. The land and memory were intertwined, and he was a part of that cycle, not separate from it. By the first light of morning, Jeb felt a change within himself. The heaviness in his chest was lighter, not gone, but tempered by understanding and acceptance. He knew he would never forget, nor should he. Memory was a gift as much as it was a burden, and the land had taught him that. He mounted his horse and rode slowly across the valley, touching the scorched earth gently with his hand as he passed, feeling the connection between himself and the place he had once fled. He knew that rebuilding would take time, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He could not undo the past, but he could honor it. He could respect the land, remember its lessons, and live with humility and care. The woman from the trail appeared briefly on a distant ridge, watching him, a small smile of approval on her face before she disappeared into the morning mist. Jeb did not need her words now. He understood what she had been trying to teach him. The cowboy rode on, carrying the memories, the lessons, and the promise of renewal in his heart. The land had spoken, and he had listened. The ashes he had knelt in would always remind him of what had been lost, but they would also remind him of what could be healed. And in that realization, he found a quiet strength he had never known, a determination to live not just as a man of the trail, but as a man who remembered, who honored, and who cared deeply for the land that had shaped him. The morning sun rose slowly over the valley, casting warm golden light across the blackened remains of the homestead. Jeb stood quietly, taking in the scene. The ashes from the fire, the scorched earth and the charred timbers were no longer just symbols of loss. They were a reminder that life, memory, and growth were intertwined. The land had taught him a lesson that no time, distance, or denial could erase. It remembered everything, and he had a responsibility to honor it. Jeb mounted his horse and rode slowly along the trail that led through the valley. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if he were moving through the memory itself. The wind rustled the sparse leaves on the burned trees, carrying with it the scent of earth, smoke, and new growth. It was a smell that felt like hope, fragile but undeniable. He felt it in his chest, a small, steady warmth that replaced the heavy weight of guilt he had carried for so many years. As he moved through the valley, Jeb began to notice the tiny signs of life, that had returned. Small green shoots were pushing through the ashes, stubborn and bright against the black soil. A bird sang from the top of a scorched tree, its song clear and full, as if the land itself was celebrating renewal. Jeb dismounted and walked among the shoots, touching the soil gently, feeling a deep connection to the earth beneath his boots. It had survived, and somehow, so could he. He thought of the people he had lost, the mistakes he had made, and the promises he had broken. For a long time he had tried to forget them, burying the memories deep in the corners of his mind. But now he understood that forgetting had been impossible. The land had remembered for him, and by facing it, he could finally take responsibility. He knelt in the dirt, placing his hands over the ashes where the house had once stood, whispering words of acknowledgement and apology. "I see now. I remember. I am sorry." Hours passed as he worked quietly, not just gathering the charred remnants of the past, but arranging them in a way that honored the lives that had once been there. Letters, photographs, small personal items, each piece carefully cleaned, each piece carefully placed. It was a memorial, simple and humble, but it was enough. Enough to show respect, enough to show that he remembered, and enough to begin healing. As the sun climbed higher, Jeb realized that he could not do it alone. The land was patient, but it also taught that memory and care are shared. He thought of the townspeople he had avoided, the neighbors he had ignored, and the ones who had once called this valley home. He decided he would return to them, share what he had learned, and help preserve what remained. The fire had destroyed many things, but it had not destroyed the spirit of the land or the memory of those who had lived there. Jeb rode toward the distant hills, his heart lighter with each step. He thought again of the woman from the trail. She had guided him, warned him, and reminded him that the land kept record even when people tried to forget. He did not need her now, for he had understood her lesson. He had faced the ashes, confronted the past, and acknowledged what had been lost. The next step was renewal, not just for the land, but for himself. He paused at the edge of the valley, looking back one last time. The fire-scarred earth seemed less forbidding now, and the new shoots of life promised hope. He whispered a small prayer to the wind, not for forgiveness. He had already found that in facing the past, but for strength, for guidance, and for the courage to move forward. The valley was no longer a place of fear or regret. It was a place of learning, remembrance, and promise. Jeb spent the afternoon gathering materials to begin rebuilding. Small steps at first. He cleared debris, arranged stones, and began marking areas where the land could recover. Every movement was deliberate, a gesture of respect to the memory held in the earth. The work was hard and he could feel the aches in his muscles, but it was satisfying in a way he had never known. The land had given him life and lessons. Now he would return something in kind. As evening approached, the valley glowed under the soft light of the setting sun. The air was warmer, carrying the scent of earth and new growth. Jeb built a small fire for warmth and light, sitting beside it with a quiet sense of peace. He thought about the people he had lost, the lessons he had learned, and the responsibility he now carried. The land had remembered, and he had remembered too. The bond between himself and the earth felt unbreakable now, a promise that he would honor the past while tending to the future. Night fell, and the stars shone brightly in the clear sky. Jeb lay beside his fire, listening to the wind, the rustle of small animals, and the distant calls of birds and creatures waking in the night. He felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the land, but to life itself. The ashes were no longer a symbol of guilt or fear. They were a foundation upon which he could build, a reminder that memory and care create the possibility of growth. Sleep came gently, filled with dreams of green valleys, strong trees, and peaceful skies. He dreamed of people he had loved and lost, smiling faces restored in memory. He dreamed of the land flourishing, small shoots growing into strong plants, and the valley coming alive again. For the first time in years, he felt hope, quiet and steady, and he understood that renewal was possible if one was willing to face the past fully. When morning arrived, Jeb rose and mounted his horse. He rode slowly through the valley, pausing often to touch the earth, to acknowledge the memory of the fire, and to witness the life that had returned. The wind carried the sound of the past and present together, the echoes of lives long gone and the promise of growth yet to come. He knew he would return often, not just to tend the land, but to honor the memory it held, ensuring that what had been lost would never be forgotten. By midday, Jeb reached the edge of the valley, looking out across the open plains that stretched to the horizon. The wind was warm, carrying scents of earth, grass, and distant wildflowers. The woman from the trail appeared briefly on a ridge, watching him once more. This time, her face bore a small, approving smile. She did not speak, for words were unnecessary. The cowboy had understood. He had knelt in the ashes, faced the truth, and begun the work of renewal. Jeb continued his journey across the plains, feeling lighter with every step. The past was not gone, nor would it ever be forgotten, but he had learned the land's lesson. Memory demands respect, acknowledgement brings clarity, and care creates growth. The ashes were no longer a reminder of failure. They were a symbol of the possibility that comes when one faces the truth with courage. He thought of the valley behind him, of the charred trees, the blackened soil, and the tiny green shoots breaking through. They were a testament to life's resilience, and he knew that he too could grow stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The land had reminded him of what he had tried to forget, and now he would live in a way that honored that memory. As the sun set across the endless plains, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, Jeb rode toward the horizon with a renewed spirit. The wind whispered through the grasses, carrying the memory of fire and the promise of new life. He felt a deep, abiding connection to the land, a bond forged in ashes, strengthened by acknowledgement and renewed through care. Jeb understood that the journey was ongoing. Life would continue to challenge him, memories would arise, and the land would continue to remember. But now he was ready, ready to face what came, ready to honor the past, and ready to nurture the future. The valley had taught him, and he would carry its lesson wherever he went, that the land remembers what you forget, and that by facing it, a person can find peace, purpose, and renewal. The cowboy rode on, across the plains and into the fading light, knowing that he had finally learned the lesson the woman had tried to teach him. The ashes of the past no longer weighed him down. They had become a foundation for life, memory, and hope. And in that understanding, Jeb felt a quiet joy he had not known in years, the joy of a man who remembered, who acknowledged, and who had begun to heal, just as the land itself had begun to heal.